welcome back to the Hard-Headed Sports Podcast, everybody. On the other side of the break, we were talking about Portland Trailblazers and Damian Lillard and whether or not the Trailblazers were failing Damian Lillard as the face of their franchise and whether they were giving him enough personnel, enough good help for him to be able to do anything substantial in the Western Conference, because they continuously get bounced out in the first and second round, and obviously that front office is making some changes. We talked about Terry Stotts getting fired, we talked about free agency, draft history, trading, we talked about all that, and I want to transition from that front office to a different front office on the Eastern Conference, and that is the Boston Celtics, who themselves are going through some front office changes at the moment. President of Basketball Operations, which is essentially a really long, fancy phrase to say the general manager of the team. President of Basketball Operations, Danny Ainge, who's been there since 2003, is retiring, and Brad Stevens, who is the current coach of the Boston Celtics, is going to be replacing him in that role, which I find to be a very, very interesting dynamic. It's a very multifaceted topic that we're going to be talking about today, because a lot of people are talking about Danny Ainge's legacy and whether or not he did a good job as the Boston Celtics general manager, but there's also the conversation of whether or not Brad Stevens is the right person to be fulfilling that role when the Boston Celtics kind of had not such a good season. And I'm not quite sure where I want to start first, but I think, now that I'm talking out loud, I want to start with Danny Ainge's legacy. And a lot of people are saying, well, he didn't necessarily do that good of a job as, president of basketball operations for the Celtics. And I think a lot of that is because there are such high standards for the Celtics. It's championship or bust pretty much every single year. You look at where the Boston Celtics were right before they traded for Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett. And, Paul Pierce was on the verge of leaving. It was not a great season. I think they finished last in the conference. And then, Danny Ainge said, okay, you want some more veteran players? I've got you. He traded for Ray Allen and he traded for Kevin Garnett, and they had the biggest single win turnaround, I think, in the history of the league. 42 more wins than the previous season, and they won the championship that year. It was the first essence of the quote-unquote big three. You can argue that Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Tony Parker were the first, but realistically speaking, everybody will remember that Celtics team as being the first iteration of the big three. And then moving on from that, he also pulled off one of the most lopsided trades in the history of the NBA, trading away Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce to the Brooklyn Nets for a buttload of picks that they used wisely throughout the years. And that trade really was what set the Celtics up for some long-term success in the last decade or so. And even though they haven't been able to win another title, they made the Eastern Conference Finals in 4 out of the last 5 years. And when you consider that LeBron was in the East, you always have to go through LeBron. Obviously not so now because he is in LA, but have to go through LeBron every single year to be that good, that consistently. Really should be, we should be applauding Danny Ainge for his effort in that, because not only did they use the draft picks very wisely, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, some other picks as well. Marcus Smart ended up being one of those draft picks that came as a product of the Brooklyn trade. Danny Ainge did a really good job, and consistently throughout his career, despite some really, really odd circumstances like Gordon Hayward, completely shattering his ankle in the first 10 minutes of being a Celtic, and then Kyrie Irving coming over from Cleveland and saying, you know what, I actually just kind of can't stand Boston, and I want to go play somewhere else. With all of those, bad breaks towards the latter half of the decade, with Boston being, quote unquote, and this is something that players will say often, it's kind of been floating around, is that Boston is a racist town. So, with racism in Boston, and with consistently, having some bad breaks, Danny Ainge has still been able to put out a good team consistently. And, I don't think he's going to stay retired, but the man who's replacing him, Brad Stevens, is an interesting story. And I actually find this move, going from the coaching position to the front office, to be absolutely genius by the Boston Celtics. And here's why, essentially. I know the product that was put out on the court this past season for the Celtics was not really a good one. I mean, injuries here or there and dealing with COVID protocols is never going to help you, but they should have done much, much better this season than they did. And Jason Tatum is a rising star. He had his ups and downs. When you take a look at the product that was put on the court by the Boston Celtics this season, it immediately pointed to Brad Stevens. And a lot of the conversation throughout the season is Brad Stevens on the hot seat? And the comments that he's made over the past week or so was that he was just mentally fatigued from coaching. And when you take a look at the product on the court, as I said, that kind of clicks. I don't think he's lying. I think that makes sense as to why the Boston Celtics underperformed this season. So, to say, well, if he's worn out as a coach, what makes you think that he's going to be any better as a GM? Well, first and foremost, there is no better person to be the next general manager of a franchise than the person who just spent however many seasons that Brad Stevens did spent coaching those same players. It gives you a better understanding of the personnel day in and day out that you are working with, what players can do, what they cannot do. And just being in a new position, a change of scenery can often be enough for somebody to flick the lights back on and get their groove back. And the other thing is that despite what happened this season, I think Brad Stevens is a phenomenal basketball coach. There's consistently, a bunch of college teams asking for his services, and specifically college teams because they know that he has that college experience. It's very easy to go from college to the NBA. It's not so easy to go to the NBA to college. It's lopsided in that fact. So to have a coach with collegiate experience, a lot of people have been asking for Brad Stevens over the years for the Boston Celtics. I think he's a phenomenal basketball coach, and despite him being worn out this season, you would not want Brad Stevens to go to any other basketball team, because theoretically speaking, if you fired Brad Stevens would find work somewhere else in the NBA. That I can feel confident in saying without a doubt he would be on another franchise as the head coach pretty soon. So instead of having to give up Brad Stevens and seeing him coach somewhere else and losing a really good basketball coach, you put him in the front office, you give him basically control over the team that he knows like the back of his hand. To me, this is a genius move by Danny Ainge and the Boston Celtics. I think this is an absolutely genius move. It's certainly interesting, and granted, this transition has been done once or twice before, but not exactly in the same way. You talk about, coaches that become front office personnel, Phil Jackson, Pat Riley. It's been done before. It just hasn't been done exactly this way and under these exact circumstances. So I'm extremely interested to see what's going to happen in Boston. I don't think that Boston is going to be that great moving forward. I mean, they're going to be contenders in the Eastern Conference, but I'm not necessarily a fan of the roster as a whole right now. I think Jason Tatum's going to continue to be outstanding. I think Jaylen Brown, when healthy, is going to continue to be outstanding. Marcus Smart is going to be a good glue piece, but I don't think that Kemba Walker is a good fit for the Celtics, and I didn't think that Kemba Walker was going to be a good fit for the Celtics to begin with. He was absolutely just Kyrie's replacement instead of being Kemba Walker, if that makes sense. Kemba Walker has been a very inconsistent point guard throughout, his career, and to be honest with you, this is no knock against Kemba Walker because he is extremely talented, and there are moments when you take a look at his game and say, wow, this guy can play basketball at an extremely efficient level, but the jump shot hasn't always been there, and I just don't feel like he fits with the Celtics that well. I don't know if they're going to want to move him moving forward. They definitely are going to have to start, getting a couple of more rotational players, either through free agency or the draft. They've kind of used up the gigantic well that the Nets gave them with the Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett trade, and they've been over that for a couple of years now. The Boston Celtics are going to have some work to do, but again, I think there's no better person to take over the franchise than the person that has been coaching these players for how many ever seasons now. I think 7 or 8 seasons. I think it's a brilliant, genius move by the Boston Celtics, and it's going to be interesting to see if it pan out. So respect to Danny Ainge. He did a fantastic job. I know that, people are only going to remember NBA final trophies. They're only going to remember the big championships. And even though they only got one, Danny Ainge consistently, even though there were some down years, he consistently kept the Boston Celtics in contention when, previously they weren't anywhere close. So hats off to Danny Ainge. I hope he enjoys his retirement. It's going to be extremely interesting to see whether or not Brad Stevens can keep up that legacy moving from the court to the front office. Hey folks, thank you so much for listening to this segment from the Hard-Headed Sports Podcast. If you enjoyed this segment, make sure that you drop a like on the video and a comment. It helps me out a bunch. And if you're interested in watching more segments like this from the show after the show has been completed, you should definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you're interested in listening to the entire show in its full-length entirety, you should listen to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Anchor. Once again, thank you so much for watching the video. My name is Nick Ryan, and I will see you all again very soon.